I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, reform or be reformed. In the US, Wall Street looks like it's getting a makeover, but probably not the kind it wanted. We've got plans to rein in the bankers as well as economic reforms G20 style. Also, the BP oil disaster still going, still getting worse, but what about oil alternatives? They're here right now and perhaps already making a difference. And can three major hubs, all within an hour of each other, survive the turbulent world of aviation? Middle East Airlines in the spotlight as the world's biggest airport opens for business. First this week, a tiny little street at the foot of Manhattan from where, for many, the world's financial ills stem from. It's Wall Street, and it could be in for a big old shake-up. At least that's how the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, as is it officially known, is being billed. Something which will make sure the economic meltdown of 2008 isn't repeated and will regulate and rein in the bankers as necessary. The bill has now passed two major political hurdles, just the Senate vote to go, although that will be the toughest. If it makes it, and if you believe the politicians, then this is big news. President Obama's obviously been leading the charge, describing it as a long fight against the defenders of the status quo on Wall Street. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi reckons it's the toughest set of reforms in generations. But on the opposing side, and for many there, this is the prevailing view. Republican Spencer Bachus, he calls it the financial version of Obamacare, that is referring to the president's healthcare reforms, which many felt involved just too much government. But let's leave politics aside, because we know Republicans and Democrats are going to vote broadly on party lines. We know there'll be all sorts of jockeying and name-calling. Let's do some Wall Street Reform 101. And to do that, we turn to Nick Spicer in Washington, D.C., who's been following the story. Nick, as I say, forget the politics. What are these actual reforms, which, it has to be said, are being billed as the biggest financial shake-up since the Great Depression, which is a very big claim to make?
It is a big claim to make, but I think it's important to provide an order of magnitude. What happened during the Great Depression was gigantic. The federal government intervened by creating the Securities and Exchange Commission to oversee what happened on Wall Street. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to basically guarantee the savings of Americans in American banks, so there wouldn't be a run on the banks. What's happening now is not really small beer, but it's not of the same order. The most significant measure is perhaps the creation of a consumer protection agency. It's an agency which will try to limit, if not to say eradicate, the kind of predatory lending that created the subprime crisis. You remember how mortgages were given out to people who didn't have a job, didn't really have any documentation, and that created a ripple effect throughout the economy. There will also be the creation of an oversight agency which will look for systemic risks in the economy as a whole. There will also be a new exchange for derivatives, which are those instruments that kind of turbocharge the crisis, if you will, very complicated and exotic instruments whose annual market is $615 trillion a year. So those are really the significant steps that have been taken.
All right, Nick Spicer there with the word on Wall Street reform. Thanks for that, Nick. So that's financial reform. The reform of the economic kind was also an important topic up for discussion, a little bit north of Washington, Toronto actually, which hosted the G20 meeting. It was a bit of a showdown, as we illustrated last week, between the spenders and the belt tighteners, shall we say. What was the result? Sama Al-Shahat looks at the aftermath.
The G20 leaders came together in Toronto to formulate a battle plan to combat the malaise affecting the global economy.
This is the G20 communique, their battle plan, and it has two major aims. The first is to reduce countries' deficits by slashing spending and raising taxes, and the other is to achieve a global economic recovery. The problem is that these two goals are not compatible, and the G20 members know this, and that's why they're divided. On the one hand, you have the Europeans who are pursuing very hawkish austerity measures, and on the other, you have the Americans, Chinese and Brazilians who want to continue spending until they achieve a decent enough recovery, and then they'll focus on reducing their deficit. The issue, though, is this: if more countries decide to follow Europe's hawkish austerity strategy, this could kill off global demand, sending our economic recovery into a tailspin.
I don't believe that the G20, with this economic battle plan, is going to hit its targets. First of all, the target of cutting the deficit is not going to be achieved. The target of economic recovery and growth is not going to be achieved.
This is down to the classic mistake of not identifying the firepower of your enemy.
The failure of the G20 battle plan is that it does not recognize the enemy, which is a depression which is spreading through the global economy. The G20 assume that they're looking at a standard recession when in fact what they're facing is something far more serious.
Depression requires a forensic examination of mistakes committed in the past when combating financial crises. And here Japan's experience is invaluable, particularly the period from the 1990s onwards. It's referred to as Japan's lost decade because of the thousands of people whose lives were blighted because of the absence of jobs. They're called Japan's lost generation.
What they teach us is the peril of raising taxes too soon when economic recovery is still too fragile. Japan raised its sales tax in 1997 when it was just coming out of recession, causing its economy to nosedive. It was to take Japan 11 years to get back to the same level of growth.
It's difficult to understand why the G20 is promoting this economic strategy when we know from Japan that it's a form of self-inflicted damage and pain. In other words, the pain is going to be inflicted, if you like, on the G20's own troops, on their own people and on their own economies, and ultimately on their own political futures.
As we're battling with our economic reality, we should remember Japan's lost decade.
Lots of economic news bubbling away in Europe at the moment. They're still protesting in Greece. Thousands hit the streets of Athens as part of a general strike by two major unions. This is over the country's austerity measures. Remember, Greece has agreed to cut its budget deficit to 3% of GDP by 2014, down from that extraordinary 13.6% last year. They reckon they can do that by cutting pensions and various workers' rights. But despite the continued public protests, the government said it will hold to the plan and expects to meet or even exceed targets for this year. We're going to have lots more on the Eurozone crisis next week. Reports from Germany, Greece, Spain, the UK, exploring the crash, the recovery, and finding out if the worst is yet to come. Now, the BP oil spill, we tell you about it every week because, quite frankly, it's not getting any better. Tropical storm Alex, it did miss the oil slick itself, but it did also stop many of the oil skimming boats getting out on the water for about 4 days. And of course, the oil continues to pour out. And what's really worrying is we now know that it is far, far worse than originally thought. Here is some rather sobering perspective. Go back 21 years. You remember the Exxon Valdez oil disaster in Alaska? Well, in the Gulf of Mexico right now, we are seeing the equivalent of a whole Exxon Valdez disaster every 4 days. That is extraordinary. When we break it down even further, the number of barrels of oil leaking out, it was originally estimated about 1,000 a day, now actually thought to be between 35 and 60,000 barrels a day, which means all up, we're into the tens of millions now. Of course, BP says it's working hard to stem the flow, but has so far only managed to capture and burn just over 300,000 barrels, a fraction of the full amount. But let's go back to that range, the 35 to 60,000 barrels, because it's very broad. And the Deepwater Horizon Unified Command, which is in charge of the response effort, says it can't actually be more accurate. There, they say it's almost impossible to gauge how much oil is gushing out because it's too difficult to get measuring devices close enough to the leak. Also, problems measuring what oil has actually been captured. Usually we talk about barrels, you know, oil in a barrel. But when it's captured oil, we're talking about gallons. That is because when they capture oil, they're actually talking about oily water. Only about 20% of that is actually oil. And so one of the many things to come out of this whole disaster, other than more oil, is the use of alternatives. Not just big plans for the future, but things which can be used right now. Natural gas, for example, widely used across the developed world and in abundance in so many other parts. But is it any safer for extraction, for transport, for use? Earlier in the week, I put that to Simon Bonini from the UK gas company Centrica, who joined us here in Doha.
Natural gas is a flammable product, so obviously safety is at the heart of the industry. I'm pleased to say in terms of shipping of LNG globally, we've been doing that now as an industry for 50 years without a single major incident. So the track record is very good. If we look at the product, gas is a gas. So if there were the unfortunate event of some incident, the gas will disperse into the atmosphere.
Now, in the UK, you are importing a whole lot of gas from Qatar, and I believe in a few years you're hoping to get 20% of the UK's gas in there. What sort of impact is that having there, both you know, economically and then on the environment?
Well, in terms of the environment, just the imports that have been done to date have allowed the UK to reduce its carbon emissions by the equivalent of 4 million cars off the UK roads. That's the total impact that Qatari gas arriving in the UK has had to date.
Having said that, though, the production of natural gas and the factories that are used here and all that, is there, I mean, you and I were talking about the environmental benefits in the UK at the moment, the fact that you've been able to bring down carbon emissions. I mean, is there almost an offset here that there's actually quite a lot of carbon emissions from this part of the world as a result of the gas facilities? There are. To produce LNG, you need to burn about 10 to 14% of the gas to produce the power to liquefy. So on a per capita basis, Qatar has a large CO2 footprint on a per capita basis, but of course that's because the population is relatively small. And we really wanted to highlight that when you take into account the net effect in the importing countries, the consumption point, that what appears to be a high carbon footprint is actually reduced dramatically. When Counting the Cost returns, we look at Middle East aviation, the new playground for expanding airlines, plus a chocolate biscuit factory in Gaza and the story it tells about what can and can't leave the coastal strip. That and plenty more still to come. Welcome back to Counting the Cost, your one-stop business and economy shop right here on Al Jazeera. Next time you take a long-haul flight, there's a pretty good chance you might go through an airport in the Middle East. There's been a huge rise in transit traffic through the region's airports, particularly the Gulf's big three. We're talking Abu Dhabi, Doha and Dubai. The latter has just opened the first phase of another billion-dollar airport, which by all accounts will be the world's biggest when it's fully operational. Rachel Turner now with more on how the Gulf is spreading its wings.
The first plane touches down at Dubai's new airport. Al Maktoum International officially opened this week. Dubai is banking on this becoming the biggest airport in the world.
Dubai World Central will become the world's largest airport with 160 million passengers and 12 million tons of freight. So actually starting with the first phase with a single runway is a very historic moment, because eventually we'll have 5 runways, a very large terminal building, and the city around the airport will develop over the next 15 and 20 years. So it's a very, very significant landmark for Dubai and for the aviation industry.
Despite worries over the country's $100 billion debt, the project is still ongoing. Passenger numbers through the country's existing airport, Dubai International, have been soaring. In terms of international figures, Heathrow retains its spot as the busiest airport in the world, with 4.8 million passengers in March. Paris Charles de Gaulle saw over 4.2 million. Hong Kong is the Far East's leader, with over 4 million passengers, and also seeing 4 million passengers in March, up nearly 25% on last year. Dubai is the 4th busiest airport in the world. Neighbours Abu Dhabi and Qatar are vying for a piece of the action too. Both are also building new airports. Abu Dhabi is investing $5 billion on its new airport. Qatar is spending $7 billion on its venture in Doha. The airport will be almost the same size as the city centre, but eclipsing them both is Dubai's new airport complex, set to be able to take 160 million passengers once it's completed. That's 3 times the size of Heathrow, and it's costing a whopping $32 billion. Last year, airport footfall grew 7% globally, but the Middle East grew by 33%. Geography is a huge factor in this growth, with the Gulf being a hub for transiting passengers. And unlike Heathrow, for example, in the desert there's unlimited space to expand and no neighbours to complain about the noise. But probably the biggest reason is the international carriers based here. Emirates in Dubai, Qatar Airways in Qatar, and Etihad in Abu Dhabi. With the global recession, passengers are looking at price, and these carriers are offering routes at prices others can't. Taken together, these 3 Gulf companies represent 10% of all orders for the new Airbus A380s at $110 billion in total. So while passengers may be feeling the pinch, these airlines certainly aren't showing it.
Let's talk more about this now with Matthew Simons. He's the industry editor with The Economist. Good to have you with us, Matthew. Dubai, first of all. As we say, in the process of opening what will be the biggest airport in the world eventually. My question is, does Dubai really need that? Are the growth projections so big they're going to need an airport with 5 runways?
Well, I mean, you know, who can say whether those projections are accurate? But the rate at which they've been expanding over the last few years, they would certainly be running out of capacity within only a few years from now if they weren't making this enormous investment. Also, it's worth remembering that the new airport, the Al Maktoum Airport, will not become fully operational probably for about another 12 years or so. So they've got a little while to grow into it.
OK, so that's Dubai's plans. With all that in mind, we've got to look at the competition too, Matthew. We're looking specifically at Doha and Abu Dhabi. Do you think the likes of say, Doha and Qatar Airways, I mean, they're building a brand new airport here too, custom built for the A380 Super Jumbos, as I understand. Again, is there real need? Is there enough demand in the region to have so many hubs so close to each other, so much expansion?
I think as far as Doha is concerned, it is probably far enough away from Dubai to be able to make a different offering. For me, the big question is about Abu Dhabi and Etihad. I mean, Etihad, I think, is a very good airline, but the airport at Abu Dhabi is only going to be about 40 minutes by road away from the Al Maktoum Airport, and if, as is expected, there's a new fast rail link, high-speed rail link, then that may be only 20 minutes or less journey time between Al Maktoum and Abu Dhabi. So that's where I think that there could be some difficulties.
Matthew Simons, good talking to you. Thank you for your time. Staying in the Middle East, Iran's inflation is on the rise. Official figures put it around 10%, but outside observers reckon it's probably more than double that. Now, smaller banknotes are losing their value, so consumers are having to use more, leading Iran's central bank to unveil a new banknote, the highest denomination ever, which is apparently nothing to do with rising inflation. More now from Ali Reza Ranaki in Tehran.
Iran introduces its largest banknote ever, a green 100,000 rial bill worth about $10. The government says it's meant to reduce millions of dollars spent every year on destroying old bills and printing new ones. Experts say inflation has made the larger denomination a necessity. They say the 100,000 bills will make it easier to pay for more expensive items. But some people say the 100,000 rial bill is not good for poorer consumers.
Many people earn less than 3 million riyals a month, and poor people will have trouble finding the change when spending such a huge banknote.
Some people fear that things will get even worse when state subsidies on fuel and electricity are lifted in a couple of months. To them, the green banknote is an ominous sign.
It's a sign of our money losing its value. It shows that because of inflation, small banknotes have turned into garbage and we are getting poorer.
The government says there's nothing to worry about. It says inflation is below 10% and denies the low investment and low GDP figures forecast for the new Iranian year. Many people have not seen the new banknote yet, and most couldn't care less about it. They would if it could buy a solution to their economic problems. But that price is too high, even with a 100,000 rial bill.
To Gaza now, and chocolate biscuits. Not what we usually talk about when we discuss the Strip, the siege, the stranglehold on the economy there. And when we do talk about that, it's usually about the lack of imports. But see, Gaza can export too, or at least it could if the restrictions for the last 3 years hadn't been so harsh. Nicole Johnston now with more on Gaza and how the Chocky Bickies can't get out.
I asked the Israelis, you want to live a good life in Tel Aviv, but why take the people very difficult to live in the Gaza?
Biscuits coated in layers of chocolate and wafers wrapped in ribbons of sugar. This is Gaza's largest biscuit and sweets manufacturer. The company is called Al Olda, and at its helm is Mohammed Tilbani, He started the business more than 30 years ago. From nothing, he's built up a factory floor with 350 employees, producing dozens of sweets. But Israel's siege on Gaza has hit the business hard.
Israelis close everything to the Gaza. The spare parts, the machine, the material. Like the example, what's the problem for enter the cacao powder?
Israel has announced it's liberalising its siege on Gaza, allowing in products that have been banned for 3 years. So now items like toys, clothes, biscuits and sewing material are being trucked into Gaza. But Israel's so-called easing of the siege does not end the blockade on business. Factories like this aren't allowed to import equipment or spare parts. Another problem is raw material. Israel sends in flour and sugar for people, but manufacturers can't buy it. Instead, they rely on tunnels to smuggle goods into Gaza. This adds an extra 40% to the cost of the product, and there's no quality control.
To work with the tunnel is very, very difficult, very bad. Sometimes I damage 30% from the goods, sometimes 100% is damaged.
Before the siege, the factory produced 250 tons of sweets and chocolates each week. Since the siege, it makes no more than 80 tons.
This may look like a busy working factory, but in fact, it's only operating at less than 30% of its capacity. But the owner says that if the siege was lifted, he could open this factory 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
With the hours of work cut, it's a hard time for employees. Sabrine has been with the company for over 20 years and earns around $10 a day. But since the siege, there hasn't been enough work.
It doesn't make sense to us. In the past, we worked all the week, but now we only work 7 or 8 days a month. This is the minimum to keep us alive. Then we have to wait for the next month.
Before the siege, the company's biggest market was the West Bank. But under the blockade, it's not allowed to export. Its products are trapped inside Gaza's borders.
To work with our full capacity, we need to export and need to expand. We have another market, but we cannot reach it. We have in the West Bank a market bigger than our market in Gaza.
This company has a dream: to see the Al Olda brand on supermarket shelves across the Middle East and maybe even around the world. But this is impossible while Israel maintains its siege on Gaza and its grip on the economy.
I want to do like all the factory in the world, to make export, but I don't have no seaport, no airport, no border. This is my future, to hope to do it one time in my life.
There you go, chocolate biscuits from Gaza, something a little different. Don't forget to check out Counting the Cost online. Plenty more for you there when you click on the programs link at aljazeera.net/English. We post whole episodes of the show there along with a weekly blog. Our broadcast times have changed too, so check those out as well. And if you're on Twitter, have a search for AJ Counting Costs, that's me. Interesting links and updates on next week's show are posted there throughout the week. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.